Welcome back to the History of Being Human podcast. I'm the host, Noel Armstrong, still attempting to resurrect sense and meaning from the dust of a billion factoids. In this episode, I'm going to continue the series on the mysterious deaths of historical figures. This time looking into the life and death of one of the heaviest hitters in all history, Alexander the Great. A man who changed the course of world history and probably left as great a mark on the world as any person who ever lived before or since. I don't really know who else would be on that list, maybe Newton, Karl Marx, Jesus. But I know we're in rarefied air here when we talk about Alexander the Great. And knowing that I personally lack the classic scholarly chops to do justice to the topic, I reached out to Professor Philip Freeman, and he has been very generous with his time, knowledge, agreed to come on and educate us about the topic. Professor Freeman received his degree in classical studies from the University of Texas and his PhD in classic and Celtic studies from Harvard. He's since taught at several venues, currently holds the Fletcher Jones Chair of Western Culture as a professor of humanities at Pepperdine University in Malibu, California, which must be a constant trial and hardship for you, doing what you love in the most beautiful place on earth.
It's certainly hard to keep the students' attention, yes.
I didn't think about that. Well, my heart goes out to you. Winner of numerous grants and awards, creator of his own TED-Ed series, author of numerous papers on classical and Celtic topics, and what's more germane to today's discussion, the author of over 20 books, many of which provide readable, entertaining access to some of the great classical minds. Others are biographies, including the definitive, highly readable, and entertaining biography on Alexander the Great, which is why I've asked you to come on today, Professor Freeman. Thank you very much for being on the podcast.
Well, thank you so much for having me.
And what are you working on currently?
I am currently working on a biography of the Emperor Julian. He's known as Julian the Apostate. It was at the end of the Roman Empire, and he was the last pagan emperor of Rome. So I'm doing that for Yale University Press.
Kind of sounds like the Roman Akhenaten.
Yes, he was. He was the last gasp, I guess you could say, of the old ways. He was raised in a Christian family and was, at least as far as we can tell, a devoted and loyal Christian as a young man, but then he changed his mind and decided to go back to the old Greek and Roman religion.
Well, look forward to that. How far are you along?
It's in the review stages, and we're, dotting the I's, crossing the T's, and getting everything together. So it should be out, within 6-8 months, something like that, I think.
One thing that I've found, and maybe you found this also to be the case, when I reach out to people like you who are so prolific and you have your hands in so many pies and create so much, it seems like the people who would have the least time, they're usually the most generous with their time. Some people who don't nearly have as much on their plate as you do, who aren't nearly as generous with their time. So I really do appreciate it.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Absolutely my pleasure.
Thank you. Today I want to specifically address the death of Alexander the Great. But I wonder if we could set the stage first. As your book tells, I think, a very compelling story about Alexander. Very interesting life, very interesting person. And so first I wanted to start with who he was. Who was Alexander the Great? What do we know about his parentage, his upbringing, those kinds of things?
Sure. Alexander the Great was born in the land of Macedonia, which is in the very northern part of Greece. His father was named Philip, or Philip the Great later. His mother was Olympias, who is from Epirus, which is really modern-day Albania. So he was a young prince who was born into this very powerful family. And Philip, his father, was actually an amazing man in his own right. He had risen in the 4th century and had conquered Greece. So Alexander was born into this family, but he was also thought of as kind of an outsider because his mother was not Macedonian. She came from this foreign land. And so he was never viewed by the people of Macedonia, by the aristocracy, as pure Macedonian. And that caused him some trouble later on.
Is it true that his mother was a member of a fairly bizarre Dionysus cult, slept with snakes?
It seems to be true. I mean, that's the sort of thing that later anti-Alexander people really spruced up a bit. But yes, snakes, as strange as it sounds, in ancient Greek religion, snakes were actually, used. They were a part of it, especially in the more exotic branches, such as Olympias would have been a part of. So I think it's actually true, the story that Philip came in one day not too long after their marriage and saw her curled up in a bed with a bunch of snakes, and that sort of turned him off for a long time after that. But yeah, that is probably has some truth in it, might be a better way to put it.
Probably not the effect she was going for. Their relationship seems to be, I guess I would say, complex.
Yeah, tumultuous, really. Certainly not a happy, calm marriage. She was very smart, very strong-willed, and absolutely determined that Alexander, her son by Philip, would be put on the throne as the heir to her father. And so Philip was married to other women as well, and he had other children. And so it was something kind of like Game of Thrones, really, about trying to jockey for power always. And the whole court of Macedonia, it was wild and crazy in a way that most of ancient Greece was not. There was murder and sex and betrayal going on constantly, and very few Macedonian kings died of old age. They were usually murdered by somebody. And so Alexander grew up in this atmosphere.
From reading some of the accounts in your book and other places, it seems like a lot of the conflict came over some drunken banquet or other. But there's just a huge amount of drinking in Philip's household. It seems like he was drunk all the time.
Yes, the Greeks were great drinkers, but the Macedonian Greeks up in the north were they could beat anybody, and it was very common. Every banquet that a Macedonian had, you would drink until you just collapsed of unconsciousness, and so there was lots of drinking going on, and as in when drinking happens, there was violence and words spoken that probably shouldn't be, and so that was going on all the time in Macedonia.
You specifically mentioned that Philip had his own accomplishments, his own great deeds. That brings up one of the questions that comes up with Alexander all the time. How much was he just riding Philip's coattails?
So it's a great question. I mean, Philip was an amazing man, and if his son Alexander the Great had never been born, we'd be studying Philip the Great. He wouldn't probably be as great as Alexander, but still he'd be like Hannibal, one of the really remarkable generals of the ancient world. Philip built an army that was professional, that was incredibly disciplined. They were modern for the time. They were just a tremendous fighting unit, and Alexander inherited that. So that was really crucially important for Alexander. And Philip had conquered all of Greece, and so he could draw on all the resources of Athens and Corinth and other towns. And so Alexander inherited that too. But what Alexander did with that went far beyond anything Philip had ever, I think, even dreamed of. And so, we absolutely have to give credit to Philip, but Alexander stood on his own.
So what exactly made the Macedonian army so formidable? They had 18-foot lances. That was a new innovation at the time. Crossbows. What made them so irresistible?
They had one of the first real engineering corps in the army, so that if they besieged a city, they had all sorts of different ways and techniques and catapults and everything else you could think of. The Greeks hadn't really used that much before. You mentioned the spears. Yes, the 18-foot-long sarissa spears, which is just an incredible instrument. You can use that in a day before gunpowder and guns and all. You can simply outreach your opponent if you have an 18-foot spear. But the trick is you have to get 100 men lined up, and you have to get them organized, and you have to get them so they don't run into each other with these spears. But if you can do that, you can push your way through just about any battle line there is. And so they drilled great discipline, and they were really good on horseback. They were really a very professional army.
Yeah, I can imagine if you had that length of weapon and inadequate training, it could just be a disaster. That's probably why nobody could mimic Philip's techniques right away when he was conquering all of Greece.
Right. Yeah, the Athenians, they spent most of their time arguing with each other. I don't think they ever could have cooperated with 18-foot spears. So, yeah.
What about Alexander himself? What was he like as a person? Let me just pointedly ask this. What did Alexander have that the vast majority of humanity does not have, that you and I don't? Well, you might have, but I don't have.
I think, first of all, he was very smart. He had the best teacher in the world. Literally, he had Aristotle as his teacher. And he was incredibly inquisitive and wanted to know about geography, science, literature. And so he just absorbed everything he could get. But he also had ambition. He had ambition, I think, in a way that outstrips anybody else that I know of in history. He wanted to make a name for himself. He held up Achilles and Hercules as his models. And so it was a tremendous talent combined with a tremendous ambition that made Alexander, and also just a lot of bravery and sheer luck, I think, that made Alexander the great man that we know.
What would you say, was he a great tactician, or did he leave much of that to his generals?
He was, I think, a great tactician. He faced armies, just about every major battle that he ever faced, he was outnumbered, sometimes far outnumbered. So he had to figure out ways in order to overcome the advantage of the enemy. And one way he did that was through daring, through speed, trying things that you would never normally do in an army. So he was innovative, and he would face down armies that were 2 and 3 times the size of his, and just by using all of these different tactics that were totally unexpected.
He fought alongside his father on a few occasions, and you almost get this David and King Saul thing where he gets more glory, and it sounded like Philip may have developed some jealousy for his own son.
Yeah, I think so. Alexander was great as a teenager fighting, and he, from the very beginning, was ambitious and he was not shy about proclaiming and proving his own abilities. And so, yeah, I think Philip did get a little jealous of Alexander, when he was even young.
There's an episode in your book where I think Philip divorces or at least shuns Olympias.
Right. Yeah, Philip has been pressured by the Macedonian nobility to divorce Olympias, who's from a foreign land, and disown Alexander as his heir because Alexander is only half Macedonian. And so Philip thinks he's being very generous, and he invites Olympias and Alexander to the wedding of his next bride, which is just a bad idea. And they get, Philip drinks too much, everybody drinks too much, except Alexander. He did, certainly drank a lot sometimes, but he kept his head better than most of the Macedonians, and so they get into a bitter argument, and Philip is just about ready to kill him, and they both flee in exile to Olympias' homeland of Epirus.
And then how did they make their way back into the court of Philip?
Well, Philip was planning even then an invasion of the Persian Empire, or at least the part of the Persian Empire that was closest. And he had a child, but the child was a daughter. He didn't have an heir. And it was traditional, and it was important in Macedonia to have a male heir in place before you begin a great war, just in case you're killed. And so he reluctantly invited Olympias and Alexander back, and he confirmed Alexander as his heir.
What do we know about Alexander personally? Some of the accounts I read of him, he seems incredibly generous and almost wise, certainly wise for his age. In other accounts, though, he acts rashly, overly violently, or vengefully. I'm never sure how to feel about these conqueror types because they're almost universally lauded for their accomplishments, and yet they leave misery, death, and destruction in their wake wherever they go.
Well, he could be and was incredibly generous. He, was not a greedy man in the sense of wanting to keep all the money or even sometimes all the power for himself. But he had that Macedonian quality of striking out sometimes, especially when he'd had too much to drink. And so he could be impetuous. He could be angry. He held grudges, and sometimes he could be cruel even. I think, compared to other rulers of the time, he was no more so than Caesar or Hannibal or Philip or anybody else. But he was smart. And I think that's, again, I come back to that as one of his best qualities. He was intelligent, and he knew how to apply all of the things he had learned to practical situations. And so I think he would have been a fascinating man to sit down and have dinner with. I think he would have been very interested in listening to anybody who had something remarkable to tell him. So I think he had many admirable qualities, but he had some that were not.
The other question I have when I read through some of the accounts in your book, Alexander seemed to start to push the cult of Alexander, the idea that he was chosen by the gods or the son of Apollo or something like this. Do you think he bought into that, or do you think he was using that in order to gain the submission of...
It's an interesting question. I mean, he, like every other conqueror of the time, was not shy about promoting himself. I mean, because that sort of promotion, that sort of PR was important. You wanted a giant picture of yourself. I think of anywhere around the world in the past century where you've seen leaders who put up giant posters of themselves. I think Alexander would have done that himself. As he moved around and as he conquered all these different lands, he founded city after city, and instead of naming them different names, he named them all Alexander City, Alexandria. And so he was, not shy about that. And then he comes along and says that he is the son of a god, especially after he visits this great oracle of Zeus Ammon in Siwa in Egypt. And so I think, Yes, he absolutely was using that as PR to sell to the common people, to sell himself, to sell his image. But the more it goes on, the more I sometimes think he really did believe it, at least in part. If he was not the actual son of Zeus, that he had some divine drop of blood in him that made him different, because he was able to do what he did. He was able to conquer so much of the world.
You know, as I read his story, I'm almost convinced myself that he had something divine in him, because so many things worked out so well for him. Of course, until they didn't.
Until they didn't, yes. I mean, you know, if the proof of somebody's divine ability is amazing accomplishments, then, well, Alexander had that.
I skipped over one thing I did want to talk about. I'm curious what your thoughts are on whether or not Olympias and Alexander could have been involved in the death of Philip II.
Well, you know, from the very start, when Philip was murdered, that was one of the first things that people said is Alexander or Olympias is behind this. And, you know, he had motive, he had opportunity. It's the sort of thing that happened all the time in the Macedonian court. And so were Olympias and Alexander responsible? Maybe. It's about the best I can do. I would not rule it out. But on the other hand, the Macedonian court was so violent, and there was so much jealousy. I think the main story of Philip being murdered by a jilted bodyguard is probably true, but, you know, it wouldn't have been hard for Alexander to push that a little bit. So I don't know, honestly. It is certainly possible that Alexander was somehow involved, but if you force me to decide, I would say no, that Philip was a victim of yet another episode of violence and jealousy in the Macedonian court. And it just happened at a time when Alexander could take advantage of it.
It's not like Philip had no other enemies in the world.
Oh, he had so many enemies. The Athenians would have loved to have seen him dead. The Thebans and a lot of other people would have loved to have murdered Philip. So I don't think we need to pick on Alexander necessarily.
The other question that came to my mind is Aristotle agreeing to tutor Alexander among the court of the hated Macedonians. But then I realized Aristotle himself was not a native Athenian.
Right. His family was Greek, but his father was the court physician of the grandfather of Alexander. And so Aristotle was familiar as a young man with Macedonia. And so when he went back to tutor Alexander, he was going home in a way. He had been getting kicked out of Athens, and so there were a lot of problems going on there. And so Aristotle took advantage and went back to Macedonia for a few years, got very well paid to be the private tutor of Alexander the prince. And so he taught Alexander everything he knew.
There's an article I read, and I don't remember who wrote it. The thesis of this article was that Aristotle agreed to tutor Alexander specifically to get vengeance on the Athenians. I would assume that his motive was more financial.
I would think it was more financial. He would have had incredible foresight to think of Alexander. Yeah, but who knows? Aristotle was not an enemy of the Athenians, but the Athenians didn't like anybody who was associated with the Macedonians, and Aristotle from the very beginning had been. So, yeah, I mean, there could be a little bit of planning ahead, I guess, against the Athenians, sure.
Alexander comes to power in 336.
Yeah.
Immediately, he has to suppress rebellions in Thebes, Athens, Thessaly. So he has to put down the revolts that happened in Greece after Philip the Great dies.
Right.
And by 334, he's done that, and he decides to cross into Asia Minor and begins to just crush the Persian Empire battle after battle. Do you mind summarizing what he did, how that happened?
What happens is Alexander crosses into Asia Minor, what's modern-day Turkey. He has his first battle is at the Granicus River, where he's just facing the local Persian army, but still he's greatly outnumbered. But he does some fascinating tactics like charging uphill across a river, things you would never do, and he defeats the Persians, and so that's his first battle. And then he goes down and he besieges a few Persian ports, and he conquers those. And so before you know it, he's conquered the western part of Asia Minor, and he keeps going down into modern-day Syria, where he has his first battle with the great King Darius of Persia, and he beats him unexpectedly, and then he goes down into Egypt, and then he crosses over into modern-day Iraq, and the biggest battle of all at Gaugamela, where he faces the entire Persian army, even with elephants, and again, greatly outnumbered, defeats them. And after that, it's just a matter of marching and securing all the territory to the east, all the way to Afghanistan, all the way to the Indus River, and back again. When Alexander conquers, he's really conquering mostly the Persian Empire. You know, we talk about him conquering the world, and that was a great part of the world, but he's really conquering the Persian Empire, which is just a remarkable thing for a young man to do.
How much awareness did the Greeks have of China, Mongolia, Japan?
They knew about the Chinese they called the Seres, which means the silk people, because they got silk imported from China, very expensive, and it trickled across East Asia, or it came by sea from India. They certainly knew about India, and India had lots of trade with China, so India was sort of the halfway point. And so when Alexander, especially as he moves farther east, he runs into more and more people. He may have well met Chinese merchant on the Indus River. That wouldn't have been incredibly surprising if he had. And so he learns a great deal about the East. And if he had lived long enough, he might have tried to conquer China too.
That's the impression I get. I don't think he ever would have stopped. Even when there was a lull of any type, it sounds like he would just go out and challenge himself through hunting, jumping off his chariot at high speed, jumping back on. He was so driven and restless.
Yeah, he's one of those people that you meet who are just like that. They can't sit still. They always have to have a project, always have to have a plan. I could not picture Alexander sitting on the beaches of Malibu for a week and just soaking up the sun. He would have been off doing something every hour of the day.
Sometimes all through the night, for days at a time, it sounds like.
Yeah, absolutely. He would stay awake, and he had great physical endurance.
He was also a very good athlete, wasn't he? He was pretty strong one-on-one in a fight, foot race,
yes,
you name it.
Yeah, he was a good athlete. He was a great runner. He was very good in battle. He had been drilled. He knew how to fight with a sword, a spear, all of that. He was actually short for his time. There's a great story about how Alexander sits on a Persian throne, and his feet are dangling because the great King Darius was taller than Alexander.
Well, several of the greatest conquerors in history were not very tall.
Oh, absolutely, yes.
He started to drink a little heavier later on in his campaign.
Yeah, he started to drink. He started to become more like his father in that aspect. Out in the east, in Bactria and India, he did start to drink heavily and certainly too much. And he became rash in some of his actions. He ended up killing one of his most loyal supporters when he was drunk. And so, yeah, he started, by this time he's about late 20s, 30 years old, and he's not quite taking as good care of himself as he should. And yet he's still very athletic. He's still incredibly brave. There was a town in India where Alexander was the first one over the wall, and then the scaling ladders all fell, so Alexander is there with one other man fighting an entire town until his soldiers can get back over the wall. And so he did that sort of thing quite frequently.
Amazing. I heard his most difficult battle was actually in India against Porus.
Porus, yeah, because I think one reason is that the Indians, they fought differently, and it was a whole different situation. It was there in the monsoon, and so he's trying to fight against elephants. His men talk about their weapons are, just constantly wet. Everybody's miserable. The clothing that they wore was falling apart. And so, yes, he did. He managed to win the battle against Porus, but it was a very tough battle.
It's interesting, though, when you see the definition of a tough battle for Alexander, he lost somewhere between 500 and 1,000 men against, 20,000 for the enemy. So the numbers are so lopsided in every battle he fought. It's just mind-boggling.
Yes, it is. And I think, one reason that he was able to keep the casualties relatively low most of the time was that he always moved faster than his enemies. He always hit them harder and in a way that they weren't expecting, and always much faster than anybody who faced him. So much of what Alexander did, the battles that he fought, that's true. That happened. Some of the individual episodes certainly come along after the fact and they're later. But I think that, what we can reconstruct about Alexander that is certain is still quite remarkable.
Definitely. Do you think the numbers that they offer in those battles are fairly accurate? Number of casualties on each? Are we pretty close?
It's hard to say. It's so hard to say. I mean, numbers tended to be inflated in the ancient world just like they are in the modern world. But I think probably for the most part they are accurate. When you read somebody like the Greek historian Herodotus, and he talks about the Battle of Thermopylae and, 1 million Persian soldiers facing 300 Spartans, well, probably not. But most of the numbers that we have in Alexander are probably fairly close to the mark.
Well, thank you so much for indulging me in this. I've been talking your ear off about Alexander, but I love hearing all of this. I truly enjoyed that book. I recommend it highly to anybody. I know it was written in 2011, but as a book of ancient history, it really should not be outdated. It should be pretty up to date.
That's a great thing about my job. The Greeks and the Romans don't change that much. Latin, I can teach Latin, and it's not going to change in 20 years.
It's a little different than, say, computer science.
It sure is.
Let's move now to the promised topic of this episode, and that is the death of Alexander, about which there's quite a bit of mystery and controversy. First of all, how did Alexander end up in Babylon, sick, what was it, in 323?
Yes. Well, he had returned from his conquests. It took him about a dozen years to conquer the Persian Empire. And so he returned back to Babylon, which he had made his capital. Macedonia was too far on the edge. He wanted something central. He wanted something ancient. So he makes Babylon his capital. And so he goes back there, and he's busy making plans, actually. He's only 32 years old. He's making plans for other conquests. He's going to launch a naval war against Arabia and take over the whole coast. He's talking about moving against Carthage. He's talking about going back east and conquering the rest of India. So he's full of plans. And so he's organizing his army. He's getting everything together. And then he becomes ill during this time.
Why did he quit moving? I heard he came to the Ganges River, and it's described as a mutiny by his army. They refused to go further. If it's a mutiny, it's kind of a strange mutiny because he's still alive and he's still in control.
When he was in India, he is in the area called the Punjab, just on the border of Pakistan and India. And his army simply says, we are not going any farther. Alexander would have kept going down the Ganges River and to who knows where after that. But his army said, no, this is just enough. And so they go on strike. And Alexander, eventually says, okay, let's go back. And that's when they all head back to Babylon.
So I've heard of this magician who meets him outside the walls of Babylon and says, don't go in. Is that also apocryphal?
It's quite possible that is made up after the fact. Some great stories about don't go in, Alexander, or horrible things will happen. Yeah, I mean, it could be. But on the other hand, we have to remember, in our modern scientific world that we live in, we forget how important and how seriously people took omens and portents and prophecies and curses in the ancient world, and dreams for that matter. People were very serious about this. And so it wouldn't at all surprise me if there was a Babylonian magician out there saying, don't go in. That's quite possible. So, and Alexander, like most people in the ancient world, would have at least taken it somewhat seriously if somebody said something like that.
I have heard Alexander was superstitious to a fault, something that Aristotle never really drummed out of him.
Aristotle was quite scientific, but Alexander was superstitious.
Well, it worked for him. Let's just admit that right now. So what do we know about the symptoms of this illness that Alexander developed when he returned to Babylon?
Well, we know that he was typical all-night drinking party, and he fell down. He was experiencing pain. They say he shrieked as if he was hit by a blow. He had a fever. He wasn't out of it completely at all, but he was certainly feverish, and he is unable to walk. At this point, he's being carried around, and it goes fairly fast. This happens over a matter of like 2 or 3 days that he gets worse and worse, and he tries to get up, and he tries to do the sacrifices that are expected each day, but he keeps getting weaker. His fever doesn't go away. They put him in a cool bath. That doesn't work. And at this point, everybody pretty much realizes, and even Alexander realizes, that he's dying, that he's not going to make it. People have been trying to come up with what happened to Alexander. And of course, people say, oh, he was poisoned, which is possible. It's certainly possible, but it's also possible that he had malaria. It's possible that he had typhus. It's possible that any number of things could have happened, including all of the injuries that he'd gotten, some serious injuries during his years of conquest. That could have affected him. Every few years I read an article by a physician who says, I figured out what Alexander died of, and it's possible that they have, but I don't think we're going to know at this point exactly what disease he died of, but we know a description of what happened to him.
I've heard recently that he had Guillain-Barré syndrome, that actually he might have been alive when they buried him, because Guillain-Barré can paralyze all your limbs and make your heart rate faint. I'm not sure what I think of that.
Who knows on that one? It's I think it's caused by a virus, and it's certainly possible. But the funny thing is that 2,000 years ago, there could well have been diseases that just aren't around anymore. So he could have died of something that's just buried in the frozen tundra for all we know. And so it could be something we're never going to figure out.
Were there accusations of poisoning at the time of his death? Did anybody get formally accused of poisoning Alexander?
I don't think anybody got formally charged with it, but people were always talking and that maybe Aristotle himself, which I think was never going to happen. Aristotle paid somebody to poison Alexander, but there were certainly rivals. There were certainly people who had a lot to gain. If Alexander were to die, then they could take over a part of his kingdom. So there's plenty of motive and there's plenty of opportunity for people to do that. But my guess would be, once again, that Alexander wasn't poisoned. They actually just died of a disease, whether it be malaria or something else.
Fever seems to be mentioned most frequently among his symptoms.
Yes, it is. And he had these fevers before, which is one reason why people think maybe malaria was part of it. Malaria was very common in the ancient world. Julius Caesar had malaria as a young man. And so that's certainly a possibility. But the fever was there in all of the sources, the high fever. So it's possible.
I guess our best hope would be to find his remains, be able to confirm what they are, and then do some DNA testing. What are the odds of that?
That would be amazing. Of course, that brings us to, where is Alexander buried? Where's the body of Alexander? And there are, once again, people come up every couple of years. There's an article about an archaeologist who has found what they are sure is the tomb of Alexander, although he's never quite there. But they're sure this is the place where he at least was. And they're usually, they're usually up in Macedonia or down in Alexandria, Egypt. What we know for sure is that Alexander was, when he died, he was embalmed, and he was on the road back to Macedonia, his body was, in a grand parade, and his general Ptolemy, his old childhood friend Ptolemy, hijacked the body to Egypt, and he had a glorious tomb built for Alexander in Egypt, and the body of Alexander lay in the city of Alexandria there on the coast of Egypt for centuries, until sometime, we don't really know when it went away, but we know the Emperor Augustus in around the 1st century AD visited Alexander's body, and so people went there for a long time, but at some point it disappeared. The tomb disappeared. So much of Alexandria was destroyed over time by earthquakes, so it's quite possible that it fell right into the sea. A lot of Alexandria is underwater. So, yeah, we don't know, but if we could somehow miraculously find the body of Alexander, it would be amazing. It's always possible. I mean, it was just, like just a few decades ago, they were digging in the 1980s. They found what they are fairly sure are the bones of Philip, his father. They're not absolutely sure, but you can go up to Macedonia, go west of Thessaloniki, take a day trip, and you can visit the royal tombs there and see the bones.
It's interesting, too, because Alexander was not like Genghis Khan, who tried to hide his remains.
No.
He was supposed to be entombed gloriously. What was it, Cassander, who was going to bring him back to Macedonia?
Yeah, and he did get a glorious tomb. He just got it in Egypt. And Ptolemy very cleverly used it as a monument and as a reinforcement for his own rule of Egypt.
Now, there were several successors. Alexander's wife, Roxana, wasn't she pregnant at the time he passed away?
She was. She was pregnant with a son who was murdered by rivals who wanted to take over. There were a number of different people, a number of different generals who took over Alexander's kingdom, such as Ptolemy, who took over Egypt. They divided it up. So Alexander's true legitimate son from Roxanne was murdered. His mentally handicapped half-brother was murdered. Well, Olympias was murdered. Pretty much anybody you can name was murdered.
Roxana?
She was. Pretty much anybody who was any sort of a potential rival was eliminated. So it returned to the old Macedonian ways of just killing anybody who was in your way. If you want to understand Alexander the Great and Macedonia, watch Game of Thrones. That is exactly what it was like, and no exaggeration. Game of Thrones having a wedding where you end up killing all the guests, yeah, that sort of thing really happened. Well, one thing I've learned from studying ancient world, if your enemy ever invites you to dinner, don't go.
Not only historical information, but life lessons here on the History of Being Human podcast.
Absolutely. Whatever you think of Alexander, and certainly he was violent, he could be cruel, and he would be on trial for war crimes if he were alive today. But under according to the standards of the ancient world, he was certainly no more violent, probably less so than most. But yet he was able to conquer so much of the world by the time he was 32 years old that I think even if you dislike Alexander, and a lot of people throughout history have disliked him, you can't help but admire the sheer ambition and talent of this man. In the end, he wanted to build a new kind of hybrid Greek-Persian world. So he was working very hard on that when he died. If Alexander the Great hadn't lived, then we'd still be studying the Greeks, but they would have been just one of many people. It was Alexander who took Greek culture and spread it throughout the Mediterranean world and beyond, all the way to India. He's the one who, the reason the Christian New Testament is written in Greek instead of Hebrew is because of Alexander the Great. The Romans were huge fans of Alexander. That any educated Roman would have known Greek very well, and that is because of Alexander.
Well, Professor Freeman, thank you so much for sharing this with us.
Thank you so much.
And if listeners want to catch up with what you're doing, what your latest project is, or how to get some of your books, where would they go?
You can go to philipfreemanbooks.com and just do a search for Philip Freeman on the Google, and you'll find me there.